So I got home today and I was kind of bored and I was trying to figure out what I wanted to actually do, something productive, like do some work on my seminary course, or be lazy and do something completely unproductive. And while I was contemplating which way I wanted to go, I noticed that when I clicked on the mentions tab in Google Plus, I noticed that there was an atheist that had mentioned me, and he posted a response to me with the headline, Jason Peterson, have fun with this, or something like that, to that effect. So I just said, all right, I'll have fun with it. So I watched through some of his video. I haven't watched through the whole thing. I did go through some of his slides that he has. He responded in text instead of speaking. Not sure why he did that, but that's his prerogative. So I'm just going to go ahead and respond to some of the things he said. Now, the video that I posted was about God and morality, and why God's moral standard cannot possibly be arbitrary. One thing that this particular atheist did, he calls himself Sextus Empiricus. One thing he did was he read his own definitions into the definitions that I use in my video. In philosophy, that's a no-no. You don't do that. Whenever you critique an idea, you have to do it internally, because you have to show how the position that the other person is espousing is flawed. And you don't simply just read your own assumptions into somebody else's positions in order to refute it. It's nonsensical. That's not how you do philosophy, and that's certainly not how you rebut something. I was reading through some of the comments of this video, and I saw all kinds of ridiculous things. For instance, Sextus Empiricus says, I don't know anything about philosophy. I beg to differ. I would say that based on his video, I don't think he should have made such a comment, because he certainly doesn't want to make himself look worse than he already does by making such a comment. And by the end of this, we're going to see that he has no idea how to do philosophy. He may have just read some articles or listened to some YouTube videos or something, and then thinks he had sufficient knowledge to respond to my claims, but he's not even careful enough to properly represent my own position. So let me go ahead and start going through this. Now, I don't know why a multi-billion-dollar company can't get their screen share function to work half the time in their Hangouts. I'm not sure what the deal is with that, so I can't screen share the video. That means that since he did everything in text, I'm going to have to read it out loud, and I apologize if that makes it hard to follow. But you'll get out of this video what you put into it. If you do not understand what he said, rewind it back and listen to what I read again. So here we go, and he has some sound bites of me too, so we hear some clips of me talking. But here's the title of the video: Why God's morality cannot be possibly be arbitrary. And he has reply in front of it. So let's go ahead and go through it. Here's the first thing he says. First, as with all things, I will start with semantics. That's really great. Sextus Empiricus, you're gonna start by defining your terms and then reading them into my arguments. That's a great way to do philosophy. Here's what he says next. The two words I'll focus on are on possibility and arbitrary. Regarding possibility, given the modifier of can't and some things in the video, I take Jason to mean logical impossibility. Yes, he's correct. And he's referring to the title of my video, which is Why God's Morality Can't Possibly Be Arbitrary. So by saying can't possibly, I'd say yes. Logically, it cannot. And here's what he says next. As for arbitrary, if you look across the various dictionaries and wiki, you will find a theme of it being not supported by reason, necessity, etc., and being based in chance, whim, impulse, etc. Well, that's great, except for I am not obligated to use dictionaries or wikis when I define my terms. Philosophy has always been a dialogue of ideas. What philosophy is you have different ideas, and you have people who espouse these ideas arguing with each other. And that's how philosophy progresses. Now, whether they reach true ideas or not, it's another matter. But that's how philosophy progresses, and they might progress more to the area of truth, or it might progress in the falsehood. But nevertheless, that's how it progresses. And if you look, especially in the empiricist and rationalistic schools, you will find that definitions for things like reason and sense perception are used differently by different philosophers. it is not bad to, if you think that the current definitions are flawed, to make a different definition that you find to be more logically coherent. You just simply have to be able to defend the way you're using the word. We're not, and not to mention, I mean, if we had to stick with the agreed upon definitions, you know, so far as the majority of philosophers are concerned or whatnot, then philosophy wouldn't be able to get off the ground, because you'd have to have a consensus before you even start defining terms. So the introduction that he gives just shows a profound ignorance of the way philosophy works. You can certainly use a new definition of terms as long as you're not equivocating. And if you use one definition in a sentence and then you change the definition in the middle of the argument or in the middle of the sentence, then that's a no-no. That's equivocation. You're committing a fallacy. So let's go ahead and go on through the rest of this. Takes a little bit of time for him to go to the next slide. This is a really long slide. Let's see. Okay, I think we got the next one here. Okay, here's what he says next. In philosophy, this gets into things like brute facts and the principle of sufficient reason. A third definition I wish to add to our list considered words is mind independence for objective. I never used the word objective in that video with the definition of being mind independent. The whole idea that a proposition that is assented to as independent of the mind is just absurd. How can you have a true proposition independent of the mind? You can't. But then the idea that in order for something to be objective, it has to be mind independent is just simply rooted in defining objective as being mind independent. That's not the definition I'm using. So for him to take my saying that God's morality is objective and then reading the definition into it that I'm talking about mind independence when I am not talking about that is a fallacy of equivocation on his part. He's changing my definitions that I'm using in order to make my argument look bad, and that's not something you're supposed to do. By objective, what I mean is that you have an obligation to follow that standard. So, for instance, in the context of morality, an objective moral value would be something in which you're obligated to follow. And I cannot think of any better standard for how we should follow something, especially if you're going from an epistemological standpoint, than the creator of the universe that is sovereign over all things and knows all things. So that's the definition that I'm using of objective. I'm using a definition that we have to follow. We have an obligation to follow that standard. Let's go ahead and go on to the next slide. Okay, he's going to start playing my video soon, I think. The one that ultimately. Oh. Okay, and now he's going to go into what I said, what I was saying. So let's go ahead and play through the clip that he plays of me. Seen all over Facebook, the atheist argues that, well, because God's the one that ultimately determines morality, he can create a world where murder is permissible, where lying is permissible, and therefore, since morality is predicated solely upon God himself, that therefore it is arbitrary. And he replies, yes, in a world where a single entity determines morality, anything can be moral and anything can be immoral. This would not necessarily make God's morality arbitrary, but it would make it subjective. It depends on how you define subjective. If you mean confined within the mind, then yes, it would be subjective. But that's not the definition that I would use. In fact, I would say whenever I'm talking about arbitrary, I actually am also talking about subjectivity. Because as people probably know who have read philosophy, there are different definitions of subjective and arbitrary that have been used in the past 2,000 years of philosophy. In this particular instance, if I use the word arbitrary and subjective interchangeably when I'm speaking of morality, I will basically I'm referring to the same thing. I'm just using different words for it. And if that makes it unclear, that's my fault. I'll take responsibility for it. But when I say God's morality being arbitrary, I mean that by arbitrary I mean that it's just a set of rules that no one has to follow, and I would mean the same thing by subjectivity. Now, if we're talking something about metaphysics, such as the nature of moral propositions if they're subjective. If you mean by which they're confined to the mind, then yes, I would say that it would be subjective in that sense. But I'm not talking about subjective in a moral sense where you would not have an obligation to follow it. Whether something is mind independent or not has nothing to do with its validity or soundness. And if Sextus Empiricus thinks that he can demonstrate that something being mind independent is what's going to give you an obligation to follow something, then he's more than welcome to come on my channel and try and argue that point. But if he holds the same philosophy as Sextus Empiricus does, which is one of a sort of skepticism, I don't see how he could possibly argue the point, because he would have to concede that he can't demonstrate his own proposition. Play through the rest of it. And then I'm going to go ahead and show that Christianity clearly doesn't teach that it's possible for God to create a world where lying or murder is permissible. Just because Christianity doesn't teach it doesn't make it not possible. That's what he says. Well, yes, maybe if you're an atheist you would think that. But when I'm speaking in this video, I am talking from the standpoint of a Christian epistemology, where the Bible itself and the propositions therein is axiomatic. So I am talking from a Christian perspective. When I'm showing it from the scriptures that it's not possible, then I am speaking from my own epistemology. And if he can just reject my epistemology outhand, then I'll just reject his. And I'll just reject his claim that Christianity doesn't teach that, just because Christianity doesn't teach it doesn't make it not possible. I can just freely reject that claim if he's just going to reject my axiom. Because if I reject his axiom, then there's no way he could prove the truth of the proposition he's arguing right now. So this idea of trying to, I'm articulating something from the Christian epistemological standpoint. If he wants to refute this, he needs to get inside my epistemology and show how it leads to some sort of contradiction or absurd conclusion that defies logic or something like that. But just saying that, just denying what I say is not a sufficient way to show that I am incorrect on this matter, especially when I'm talking from my own epistemology. He has to refute my epistemology if he wants to get anywhere. Play through the next part. So my first objection to this argument that atheists are putting forth is that if morality is arbitrary, then moral values must be objective. Then he says, if I think you mean if morality is arbitrary, that would make morality subjective. Also, values cannot be objective. Values are products. Are minds. Let me correct him. Values are products of the minds, and thus dependent on minds for their existence. Seriously. He typed in some incorrect words, so I knew what he meant, so I just fixed what he said to make it make sense. If I want to read it how he has it typed out, it would say also values cannot be objective. Values are products, are minds, and thus dependent on minds for their existence. Seriously. Okay, so here he is. I'm talking about the nature of morality and whether we're obligated to follow it or not. And then he's also, when he's using terms like objective and subjective, he's using the term objective as in mean mind independent. I never defined objective that way, again, in that I think that's a terrible definition to use concerning morality. That's more or less a ontological description of some metaphysical idea or some idea about metaphysics. So what I have to say in this video has nothing to do with whether the moral propositions that God holds us to are confined within his mind or not. So he doesn't even understand what I'm arguing. And if he cannot represent someone accurately, then he shouldn't be saying things like Jason Peterson doesn't know philosophy, or and that probably goes for some of his friends that were posting here too, like this person here, Rain Skeptic. She says, "quote unquote atheist worldview." That made me stop dead and back the video up to make sure I heard him correctly. This little feller makes me want to reach for the brain bleach. Well, I hate to say it, but if you don't think that saying an atheist worldview is a valid term, then I suspect you may have already reached for the brain bleach, as far as I'm concerned. Whenever you're talking about an atheist worldview, you're referring to the beliefs about theology. Anytime you refer to a worldview and you're talking about a specific topic, be it epistemology, metaphysics, ontology, axiology, teleology, anthropology, and other sects of worldviews, you're going to refer to whatever belief they believe, whatever word describes what they believe concerning that portion of the worldview. So when we're talking about the existence of God, we can talk about the Christian view, or we can talk about the atheist view. Atheists have views too. They don't want to admit it, but they have their own ideas. And there's some other rude comments too that I might go through as we're going through here. But in essence, though, he's conflating. He just does not understand what I'm saying. He thinks that when I say arbitrary or subjective, that I'm talking, or when I say subjective, I'm talking about whether or not the moral proposition is independent of God's mind. It's just that's not even what I'm talking about. He says also values cannot be objective. Values are products of minds and thus dependent on minds for their existence. Yes, you're right. The values are dependent on minds for their existence, or their, especially in an epistemological context is what I'm speaking of. But I don't understand why, if something is within the mind, that we don't have an obligation to follow it. It has nothing to do with whether or not we're obligated to follow a proposition. I don't see how anyone could ever demonstrate that in order for us to have to follow something, it has to be mind independent. It's sad that so many people that have PhDs ascribe to this incoherent idea. I have not heard one person demonstrate it, and if he thinks he can demonstrate it, I would love to hear him try. So let's go ahead and go on, because that whole rebuttal shows he doesn't even understand what I'm arguing. Waiting for him to play the next part of the video. The reason why I say this is simply because if you can say that you can show that morality is actually arbitrary, then you have to provide an objective standard to it. The reason why is because you're telling the person that they are obligated to accept your conclusion that moral values are ultimately arbitrary. Okay, so here he goes, and I guess this would be where his agreement with Sextus Empiricus would come to reveal itself. He says, no one is under any obligation to accept any rational conclusion, even if it was a fact. Well, it should be if it were a fact, but he can go to grammar school to fix that. Also, the objective standard is reality. So let's read this again. No one is under any obligation to accept any rational conclusion, even if it were a fact. Also, the objective standard is reality. If there's an objective standard, then why is it that are we not under obligation to accept an objective standard? I assume that when he says objective standard, unlike him, I want to be careful with the way he's defining his terms, and I want to point this out so no one makes this mistake if they're going to critique any argument like this. Remember, at the beginning of his video, he defined an objective as mind independent. So that's how he defined objective. Now, that's not the way I define it, but that's the way he defines it. So we need to be mindful of that when we look at this, because if you try and read my definition of objective that I use into this quote, it's going to look like he's contradicting himself, but he's actually not contradicting himself. So with this in mind, I'm going to read this one more time, and I'm going to try and spell this out. No one is under any obligation to accept any rational conclusion, even if it were a fact. Also, the objective standard, that is, the mind independence, basically saying that reality is objective because reality is independent of our mind. That's what he's arguing. But he says that we're not, that even if it's a fact, we're not to accept a rational conclusion. Then I have to ask why he's so upset that I made this video. Should I accept if he thinks that what he's saying is rational, I don't have an obligation to accept it, then why insult me then? That his behavior is not consistent with what he's arguing here. Now, that's not to say that he doesn't believe what he's saying. But it is kind of strange that he would behave as if that this proposition is false, that we're not under any obligation to accept any rational conclusion, even if it were a fact. So, but he says also the objective standard is reality. Well, as someone who agrees with Sextus Empiricus, I don't know how he could, assuming he does, and from here it looks like he does, but Sextus Empiricus had a peculiar type of skepticism, where he believed that for every proposition you can find an equally plausible proposition that opposes it. So we should then withhold judgment and not really say that we can prove either proposition. So basically, what Sextus Empiricus would do is when he would argue, someone would say something and he'd be that contrarian. He would argue the opposite, and then try and bring the conversation to a standstill to show that you can't really hold all your eggs in one basket either way. So if this is the philosophy he espouses, then even by his own epistemology, he cannot demonstrate that reality is actually mind independent. So if this is what he espouses, and again I'm pretty sure it is, then he can't say things like reality is mind independent, or that in order for us to believe things, it has to be mind independent. I mean, he would be contradicting his own epistemology, and if he contradicts his own epistemology, then he cannot know what he's arguing, and if he can't know what he's arguing, then we can just dismiss it. But as for his first statement that we're not under any obligation to accept any rational conclusion, even if it were a fact, I would emphatically disagree. I mean, is he going to say that we don't have an obligation to accept the law of contradiction? I mean, if so, then his position certainly isn't logical at all. So this idea that we should, I mean, he's basically saying we don't have to be rational, and I disagree. I believe we have to be rational because God made us, and He's revealed the part of His mind to us through the Scriptures, and we have to think our thoughts after His. So because God is rational, so we should also be rational. Let's go ahead and go on. I think he's got another thing he's going to say here in the slides. It's like so basically, if you can show that moral values are arbitrary, that means there's actually an objective standard. He says yes, and the objective standard is reality, as I just said. Yes, okay, it's reality. That's the objective standard. It's the thing. Unfortunately, what you're appealing to as your objective standard is something that you can't even know about because it's independent of your own mind. And how can you know anything independent of your mind if your knowledge is only confined to what is within your mind? That's not a coherent way to defend your position. Let's go on to the next part. I guess this is that part of not being obligated to be rational. So arguing that moral values are arbitrary actually defeats itself. He says, no, it doesn't. That's just nonsense. There's a difference between X as a fact and you ought to accept X as a fact. You're switching between the two. Yeah, if something is a fact and you can demonstrate this a fact and you don't accept it, that's not rational. I'm sorry. I'm sorry if I'm being controversial here, but and this is coming from someone who I guess apparently doesn't believe that we ought to be rational, as he apparently tipped his hand earlier. But the idea that we don't have to be rational and that it's just absurd. But I guess that's what you have to believe if you're going to be an atheist, huh? The next objection is that in an atheist worldview. Oh, here he goes. He says, what is an atheist worldview? Atheism is a single proposition, not a worldview. No, atheism is not a proposition. Atheism is defined as a lack in belief in gods. That's what they usually define it as anyway. I think that definition is useless, but let's run with that because that's probably the people who deny that atheism is a worldview usually espouse that definition. A lack in belief in God. A lack of belief in God is not a proposition. It's a description. So a proposition has a subject, and then it has a predicate. And a lack of belief in God from what I can tell, doesn't have a predicate. So I don't understand how he's saying it's a single proposition. But even if it were, if he wants to define what atheism is, he needs to do so. But when you say an atheist worldview, when you say atheist worldview, or when I say it, what I am saying, since he's asking me what it is, I guess I can define it now. An atheist worldview is basically a position on the theological portion of a worldview about whether or not a God exists, if there isn't a God, which God is it, what kind of properties does he have, which also seeps into metaphysics and ontology as well. So if someone doesn't believe in God, or they lack a belief in God, if they want to put it that way, which would definitely mean that my chair is an atheist, by the way, if that's what an atheist is. I'm sitting on an atheist right now, everybody. But if that's what, that's what it is. It's a reference to a position about theology. That's all it is. So if I want to say what an atheist worldview is, if I want to define what I mean by atheist worldview, I'm just talking about your position on the existence of God. That's all I'm talking about. But if you want to say you're an atheist, I'll let you define your terms. I've had atheists that define it several different ways. Most of them will lack a belief in God, which I think is a useless definition. But if you want to define your term of what an atheist is, that's fine. But you cannot escape the fact that atheist is a terminology that can be used to describe a worldview, because the term itself specifically references a tenet of a worldview, which is theology. Go to the next part. And even the Christian worldview too, we don't share the same mind. That means that we don't share propositions. Rather, we come to conclusions about propositions on our own, on an individual basis. So if you're going to say that God has as objective because he's the one who exercises those morals and is the arbiter of them, then it would seem that in the atheist worldview, even though being able to show that arbitrary moral values would entail an objective standard in which we can weigh moral values, we'd have to come to these conclusions individually, so there would really be no way of showing in the first place that moral values are actually arbitrary, because people are going by their own faculties and coming to different conclusions. Then you have to ask, how do you know which conclusion about morality is true, and is the way that the person reached that conclusion valid and sound? Well, in order to determine that, you'd have to beg the question by assuming some standard of a finite person that has concluded that morality is either objective or arbitrary. And then so basically, the conclusion that morality is arbitrary is ultimately not provable, because it would involve begging the question of some finite standard that doesn't have any bearing, according to the very atheist that's espousing that God's moral is actually arbitrary. All right, so here he says again, and of course he's being disrespectful. But that's what you do whenever you can't defend your position. He says the objective standard is, again, reality. Well, it's too bad he can't know that, because reality is mind independent, and he believes everything is subjective, which by his definition would mean confined to the mind. He says, lay out the precept Kool-Aid. You're drunk. Yep, I've never been drunk before, but if you say so. He says, seriously, you're so preoccupied with your conclusion that you're barely forming coherent sentences, much less getting a point across. No, I'm not really preoccupied with it. I just happen to not be the very best speaker, and I'm okay with that. I don't mind speaking anyway. And maybe you're just responding with text because you might not be a very good speaker either. So, if I'm not a very good speaker, forgive me. I do the best I can, but not everybody's a Toastmaster. He says, also, I would agree with your skepticism about how a person would come to a conclusion in that everything is couched within the subjective human experience. Yeah, I think he forgot that whenever I was talking about that, when I was talking about things being subjective, I was referring to the atheist worldview, not to the Christian worldview. And by subjective, I mean, you don't have to follow it. That's what I was defining it as at the time. But he's defining subjective as being confined within the mind. So here he is. So given his definition subjective, let's go ahead and get inside his worldview and show where the car crashes. He says, also, I would agree with your skepticism, which isn't my position, by the way, about how a person would come to a conclusion and that everything is couched within the subjective human experience. well, then the proposition, by implication of what he just said, that reality is the objective standard, would have to be unknowable, because he cannot get outside of his own subjective human experience to confirm that reality is actually objective. He's basically making a claim that he cannot demonstrate with his own epistemology, because he admits that he believes that everything, all the propositions that we've obtained or ascended to, is confined within subjective human experience. Perhaps, I don't know if you read Immanuel Kant or not, but Immanuel Kant said something similar, and he may want to read them again, because he doesn't see. I mean, it's just amazing that he's saying these things. He's not seeing the obvious problems with what he's trying to argue. And of course, it doesn't make it any better for him that he made this blanket error while trying to mock me. So I don't know if that's for comedy relief or what, but if it were, then you got me, Sextus. Good job. My next objection is that it's a question, really. If God, the omnipotent, omniscient creator of the universe, is not sufficient to ground moral values, then what, pray tell, is? He says in response, no one said that God cannot ground moral values. Okay, well, that's good. And he says, people have suggested that since Euthyphro, I personally have no extra objection to people suggesting God can and does ground moral values. This will still make morality subjective. Now, again, he's defining subjective as being within the mind. If that's how he's defining it, I would agree, except for that's not what I was arguing. When in that video, I was defining subjective as not being, in the context of what I'm talking about with morality. I'm talking about not being obligated to follow a moral law that God set forth. That's what I mean by subjective. So again, he's using a different definition of subjective, and this is just showing how careless he is as someone who does philosophy. He needs to be really careful not to attribute his own definitions to other people, just as I've been careless not to, because I could have taken my definitions are right into his and done the same thing, and most people who watch this that isn't familiar, that are not careful philosophers, would probably think that I completely destroyed him. Even though I did it fallaciously, but I'm not that kind of person where I would just go and carelessly read my own definitions into somebody else's ideas. I would want to know what they mean by their terms before I start critiquing it. That's the way philosophy should be done. You shouldn't just read definitions into someone else's ideas. If there's any questions about how things are defined, then they need to ask about it instead of just trying to assume what they mean. It's not complicated. Let's go ahead and go through this. This is probably going to take a few seconds. These slide things really are hard to respond to. I didn't realize I'd be having this much space in between slides. If the creator of the universe, the one that we owe the one that has actually given us life, if he is not sufficient to be able to make rules that we have to follow, he says in response, God can certainly make rules he wants us to follow, but that's not moral realism. Well, I didn't say I advocated moral realism. I'm really, a lot of the advocates of moral realism, I think, makes fallacious arguments. I also think that people who advocate moral anti-realism also make bad arguments. I don't like the definitions used in either account, so right now I don't hold the one or the other. But I do hold that there's a obligation to follow God's law, just simply because God is the creator of the universe, and He has set the law forth in His word. And as a Christian, I'm going to follow the law that He set forth. But as far as these philosophical positions such as moral realism and moral anti-realism, I try to stay away from those terms because I don't really agree with some of the arguments that both camps use. So I just kind of try to stay away from those terms when I describe my position. Then it seems to me that any government entity that tries to impose moral values on others, or any group of people, or even any individual, has no right to impose any moral values on us in the first place. He says, fortunate for God, government, and the GOP, which means the Republican Party, a right to impose moral values isn't needed to actually impose moral values. Yeah, in a way, on some of what he says, I agree with this. I'm not I'm registered Republican, but I have a lot of disagreements with Republicans, especially in the area of imposing moral values, our moral values on others. Now for God, he can impose whatever moral law he wants because he is the creator of the universe. And no one needs to give him the right to do so because he is it. He is the de facto standard. But as for the government and the Republicans, yeah, I share his frustration. I don't hold that and just like in the Old Testament, if you didn't like the laws that were imposed under the Old Covenant, then you could leave. You could leave the country, or you could just not be a part of it. I don't. And as far as the government's concerned, anything that doesn't cause harm to others or their property, I think we should, just pragmatically speaking, I think we should make laws against those so that we can, as a pragmatic enterprise. But this idea, though, for instance, that we shouldn't let gays get married, well, we really are not going to stop them from sinning. You cannot legislate morality. You can't do it. The homosexuals actually had a right to get married before the Supreme Court ruled it, but it wouldn't be a biblical marriage. It wouldn't be what I would say ethically a legitimate marriage. Now, it might be legitimate legally speaking, as whenever you look at the Constitution. Although there were a lot of people that tried to do things like the Marriage Protection Amendment, which I thought was just a complete violation of everything of a lot of things the Constitution stated. So yeah, I share some frustration with him about the government trying to impose rules on us. In fact, as a counterexample, the Klein family, or the couple known as the Kleins in the bakery, whenever they had refused service to two lesbians that wanted them to make a wedding cake. Now that the government's trying to force them to pay $135,000 for refusing, even though businesses have the right to refuse service in the first place for any reason. There's no reason to make them pay that. The two lesbians should have just went to someone who would have baked the cake. They could have told their friends, and the other people who didn't like what the Christian bakers did could have just stopped buying from it. Money talks. But instead, the government has to get involved and punish someone for following their own moral convictions. And that's just ridiculous, and that's a violation of the Constitution. So, again, yes, I share his frustration about people trying to actually legislate their own moral views on others. The next portion of this is I'm going to go ahead and talk about the Christian God. I'm going to show how God does not a way that God can actually make a world where moral values, the state of affairs concerning moral values would be any different. He says, I don't recall the principle of sufficient reason being in the Bible, but I use it NRSVACE, so it may not be in mine. Let's find out. I'm not even sure what that acronym is, but we'll see what he has to say. I think he's got a few slides coming up. So the first text I'm going to go to is 1 Samuel 2:3, and this was this was a prayer done by Hannah. He says, a prayer done by a person, huh? Let me remind you of something you said earlier. All right, so let's see what he says. Because people are going by their own faculties and coming to different conclusions. He says, anyways, okay, I guess his point is something about different interpretations of the Scripture, but I mean, if that's the case, people had different interpretations. There's more interpretations of reality than there are the Bible. So, I mean, if he's going to go by that, then no one can know anything about reality because there's so many different interpretations of it. So, I mean, if he's going to try and use that argument, he's just going to blow up the whole point he's trying to make in this entire video. But as for different interpretations of the scripture. You know, I guess if we're going to go that route, we can't do mathematics, because if we get an addition problem incorrect, we should blame the axiom of addition, or if we reason incorrectly, we should blame the actions of logic. So we can't have addition or logic. It's not proper if someone reaches an incorrect conclusion to blame the axiom. That's just, it's stupid. If that's the case, then logic breaks down, mathematics breaks down. We can't use either one. So he really shot himself in the foot with that objection. But as for how we interpret the Bible, we just simply let the Bible interpret itself. We have to let the Spirit of God interpret the Bible. That's the principle of the Reformation. You can find that, the analogy of the rule of faith used in Romans 12:6. You can see 2 Timothy chapter 3, 16 to 17, where it says that the Bible is profitable for correction, reproof, and instruction. You can see 2 Peter 1:20, which says that the Bible is not just a matter of interpretation. So all kinds of verses that talk about letting Scripture interpret itself. So that's how we would do it. And the reason why we have so many people giving incorrect interpretations, because they're not sticking to the Bible and what can be properly deduced from it by necessary consequence. Rather, you have a lot of people that are reading inductive inferences into the Scriptures and making invalid deductions and things like that. So, and that's just part of the noetic effects of sin. So nothing to see here. And in this, Hannah says in verse 3 of 1 Samuel 2, she says, "Do not boast so proudly or let arrogant words come out of your mouth, for the Lord is a God of knowledge, and actions are weighed by him." So in essence, Hannah's saying that God is a judge over actions and whether they're moral or immoral. So he says, so God knows stuff and judges actions by the Lord is a God of knowledge. Is that referring to knowing the actions people commit, or does God have some other knowledge, like, I don't know, that of objective moral properties? By what criterion or criteria does God judge an action to be immoral? Well, there's no criterion or criteria that's binding that is independent of God. God knows all propositions. You know, and by that it means that God knows all true propositions. Now he knows false propositions too, but the false propositions themselves would be false. So that would not, by the definition of knowledge that we use, we would not count that as knowledge. He would just be, because you can't know that which is false. So you know, when you start getting into things like that, you just have to be really careful with your terms. You know, when we say God knows all things, he knows all true propositions. He is aware of other propositions that are false because he's omniscient. He's aware of other propositions. He knows it in that sense, but it's not the kind of knowledge that entails true propositions, because false propositions cannot be true. But let's go ahead and go through this a little bit at a time. He says, so God knows stuff and judges actions. Yes, that would be right. He says, by the Lord is a God of knowledge. Is that referring to knowing the actions people commit, or does God have some other knowledge, like, I don't know, that of objective moral properties? It would be that God knows the actions that people commit, and he would be the judge of whether or not those actions themselves are moral. That's what it means. As to this other stuff about objective moral properties, which again, he's talking about mind-independent properties. There's no such thing as a mind-independent proposition. I'm using objective in a different sense. I'm not using it in a sense that refers to mind independence. I'm using it in a sense of an obligation to follow. So again, he's just showing that he's not making any effort to understand the other person's position. And he says, by what criterion or criteria does God judge an action to be immoral? Well, nothing independent of itself. God himself is the standard. You can see that in Hebrews 6:13 where he swears by himself. So that answers that question. Waiting on the next clip. So in the Christian worldview, God is the be-all, end-all for morals. And we can see this too in Hebrews chapter 6, verse 13, where the author of Hebrews writes that God was not able to swear by an authority higher than himself, so he swore by himself. You see, there's no authority that God is ultimately accountable to. He says, if God is a be-all, end-all, all of morals, and there are no moral properties by which God determines an action is immoral or moral, then you can't have moral realism. Well, I never really espouse that particular position. Like I said, I avoid using those terms because Now, if he means by moral realism, he means that there are true moral propositions, then yes, I would say so. He says, under moral realism, there would be an authority God would be accountable to the moral properties. Well, that's assuming that I'm using the word objective in the mind-independent sense. You see, this is why I avoid terms like moral realism, because a lot of the moral realists, the terminology they use is incoherent with their own position. So if moral realism, as he says, because there are different types of positions on moral realism. If moral realism is defined as someone who believes that there are true moral propositions that are mind independent, then I am not a moral realist. If moral realism is defined as someone who believes in true moral propositions, then I would be a moral realist. But in this instance, that's not the way he's using the definitions. So I will say that I believe that there are true moral propositions that we are bound to follow. We're given an obligation to follow by God. But I would not argue that those moral propositions are actually mind independent of God. And that's why when I use the term objective, I did not mean it in the sense that the moral propositions are mind independent. There is no such thing as a moral proposition. Propositions are of the mind. Reality itself is not a proposition. It's not propositional. It's non-propositional. So, but apparently, Sextus Empiricus has not given this very much thought. Let's go on to the next one. Oh, before he switches, I forgot his last point. He said there would be an authority that God would be accountable to the moral properties. Yeah, that just assumes his definition of objective, which is mind-independent propositions, which is not a definition that I agree with, and that's not one that I use. So that particular objection is not relevant to what I said in that video. And even Paul makes this argument too in Romans 9, starting at verse 18, where and I'll go to it real quick, so verse 19. You will say to me, therefore, why then does he still find fault? For who can resist his will? And then here comes the point I just made. But who are you, anyone who talks back to God? Well, what is formed? Say to the one that formed it. Why did you make me like this? He says, well, apparently God gave me a mind, and I, for one, intend to use it. Seeing as Christians like their analogies, here's one. If a watchmaker makes a watch that is defective, who do we blame, the watch or the watchmaker? I don't really know how this is relevant to what he's responding to, but to the video that I stated. The whole point of the video was to show that morality can't possibly be arbitrary whenever it's given by God. But let's go ahead and address this anyway. So he says first, well, apparently God gave me a mind, and I, for one, intend to use it. Well, I'm sorry, Sextus, but you're not doing a very good job of it. Second, he says, seeing as Christians like their analogies, here's one. If a watchmaker makes a watch and it is affected, who do we blame? Well, I mean, by blame, do you mean assuming responsibility on someone? You can't hold God responsible for anything. He's the one who makes the rules. So you can blame him, but it won't matter because your standard is not the standard in which God is held to. God is the one who makes the standard. Is God the cause of sin? The answer is yes. He's definitely the cause. There's no question. God could have stopped the fall in Genesis 3 if he wanted to. He did not. He wanted it to happen. It was part of his will. And if you're uncomfortable with that, that's just what the Bible says. I would be sorry, but I'm not. But to say I don't understand how someone who is created by God, who owns their very life to God, who owes everything they have to God, can turn around and blame him. And that's exactly the argument that Paul makes in Romans 9. You can't hold, if you're the creator, you owe everything to him. The one who gave you, the one who has owns everything that they have given you. You can't steal something that you already own. God can't steal from us anything because God already owns everything. The universe is His. It's made for His glory. So his objection, if you were talking to an Arminian, maybe it would have some force, but for a Calvinist like myself, it just It's laughable. It's going to go to the next slide.
So, logically, if
I have no idea what that was, but okay. He says, we would naturally blame the watchmaker. We would cite God at fault for a defective lump of clay. Well, unfortunately, anyone who tries to blame God, their opinion is not going to matter, because God is the one who makes the rules and enforces them, and He's the one who created us. So we can't turn around and say, why did you make me like this? Because God already owns everything we have anyway. God cannot steal from us. He cannot do us wrong, because we owe everything to Him in the first place. It's going to go on. Is also, when a potter has finished molding the lump of clay, the potter has two options. The potter can either put the clay in a kiln or a kiln, or mash it and start again. Boy, he's got a lot of typos and grammar errors in this. He says, for this analogy, let's imagine the potter has finished molding a lump of clay, and we will know that the potter finds fault with the clay. Why would the potter put the clay in the kiln? Well, God would go ahead and let's be clear. It is God's will that the fall happen. Everything that happens in this world, God has complete control over, both the good and the evil. But that does not mean we can hold God at moral fault for willing these things, because God is the standard. He is the standard. In Christian epistemology, God is the standard. In the Christian field of morality, God is the standard. You can't take someone that you have no authority over and then hold them responsible in the sense of punishing them or telling them they ought to do something else. If you're accountable to them, you cannot turn around and then hold them accountable to yourself, unless that particular person concedes that they're held accountable to you. But God does not hold Himself accountable to us. He's not accountable to anybody. This whole objection he's making just completely misses the point of Romans 9. In typical atheist fashion. So what would God do if He willed the fall? Well, then He would make it happen. He would create Adam and Eve, and then they would fall in the sin, and it happened because it was His will. And if it were not, then it wouldn't have happened in the first place. And if you don't believe that we should have any moral standards that we ought to follow, then I don't understand why you would have a problem with this anyway. Let's go on to the next part. All right, so God is the one that is the arbiter of moral values. He says, okay, God can be the arbiter of moral values. That's not moral realism. Well, I never said I was a moral realist. Because the way he's defining moral realism is he's defining as a position that I don't hold to. So that's irrelevant. He needs to be more careful whenever he tries to critique people. I hope he learns something from this if he watches this video. Let's go on to the next slide. It's God that makes the calls, and there's no one that's in the place to judge God for anything that they consider to be immoral, because the question is, how can God steal from someone that He has given that everything they have actually belongs to God in the first place? So hello, Christian nihilism. Well, no, that's not really nihilism. Nihilism entails there's no true moral propositions. I don't hold to that position. So the idea of Christian nihilism is a contradiction anyway. So he needs to get his terms straight. Now, some atheists may say that that's barbaric, but the very atheists, as we can tell when we went through the polemics of the where I showed that the argument concerning God's morals being arbitrary just leads to skepticism regarding moral values for atheists. So nothing about atheism excludes moral realism. Well, I agree with that. I mean, an atheist can be a moral realist, but they just won't. But and if he's talking about mind, in the sense that something is only objective if it's mind and true if it's mind independent. They could hold to that position, but it's not going to make any sense given the implications of their beliefs concerning theology. Let's go ahead and go on. Atheists, when they try to do an external critique, they have a problem because good and evil have no meaning outside of God. He says, La proof, what makes good and evil meaningful with God? If good is reduced to terms of God, then God is good as a tautology. Well, what makes it good or evil is just that God defines it as such, and God is the creator of everything, so He makes the rules. And if God makes all the rules, and within the context of those rules, God is good would not be a tautology. It would actually have meaning because God is the one who gives it meaning in the first place. His objection just doesn't make any sense. Let's go on to the next slide. Because if there's good and evil, it has to be necessarily in the atheist worldview defined by the individual. He says, no, an atheist can believe in objective moral good and moral evil without God. Have you met Ozzy yet? Yes, I have. I've actually responded to some things that Ozzy has said. So, yes, I know who Ozzy is. Unless, of course, you mean the Ozzy that was a famous philosopher back in time. Who knows which one he's talking about. But, yeah, an atheist can believe in an objective moral good and evil without God, but it doesn't mean that their belief in it's going to be able to be justified. So yeah, but just because you believe something doesn't mean that logically that atheism entails moral realism or the belief in evil. You have to be able to demonstrate it. And what I'm talking about in this context is the logical implications of atheism. No, logically, an atheist cannot be a moral realist or believe in evil because there's no way for them to assent to the proposition that there is good and evil. You know, if you try to question on it, they wouldn't be able to defend it. So yes, if you're an atheist, you can't be that way. You may be able to believe in those propositions, but you wouldn't be able to defend them without contradicting your own atheism. Let's go ahead and go on. And if it's fine by the individual, then the person who comes along and says the thing that one atheist says is wrong is actually right. The atheist that says it's wrong says that that the other atheist is wrong for saying that moral proposition is evil. Then we have a problem because now we have two people that are finite who have come into this world as individuals and they've come to their own conclusions. And now we have two people that have approached moral values basically the same way. He says an atheist who is a moral anti-realist like me, so he is a moral anti-realist, and he has all these moral objections to God. That is comical. He says like me, and an atheist who is a moral realist like Ozzy do not approach morality the same way. Yeah, you don't. That's why you come to different conclusions. One of you is more logically consistent than the other, and certainly in this case, because atheism does entail anti-realism. Definitely Sextus Empiricus is being more logically consistent with their view concerning their view about God than Ozzy is. Let's go ahead and go on. Oh, but by the way, I don't know if he's going to answer it next or not, but he didn't answer what I said about how you resolve disagreements about morality if you have two atheists that disagree. So let's just let me know that he completely skirted over that. Saying that one moral proposition is good and one moral proposition, and that same moral proposition is also evil. So you have two atheists that disagree on the implications of this moral proposition. He said there's nothing contradictory in two atheists who are both moral anti-realists having different moral opinions. Both are not expressing their opinions as a fact about an external reality. Well, if you can't demonstrate something, I really don't see much point in trying to argue with it as if someone has to accept it. But again, we're talking about this particular atheist here doesn't believe that we have to be rational. So I guess it shows in his video. Let's go on. So now, in order to determine which one of those atheists is right, we have to beg the question of either the first atheist or the second atheist standard of morality, or if a third party comes in, we have to beg the question of their standard, which is also finite. He says, neither claim to be right, other than they are right in that it is their opinions. Well, I don't know. I've seen a lot of moral anti-realists claim they're right, but that's a case-by-case basis. My particular example was just one case, so there could be other cases. So really, again, not relevant. So moral values must ultimately be individual. So an atheist just saying, well, that's just wrong, that's just evil, it just does not work. He says, no, you don't understand the issue. Well, that's ironic. Let's go on to the next one. The atheist will say, well, it's possible that God could create a world where murder is permissible, so therefore it's all arbitrary. It's all just what God says. Now, if anything should have tipped him off on the definition of arbitrary and subjective I was using, that should have tipped him off. But again, he's too careless in his criticisms and representation of my position to care. He says, can you link a person who actually used that argument? If you can, will you? It's a crap argument. Okay, so apparently I'm supposed to get my arguments from other people. I don't agree with that. New philosophical ideas will arise, new arguments will arise. It's just a progression. If we had to take arguments from other people, then philosophy would have never have gotten off the ground. So I guess this objection that what I said is a crap argument is ironically a crap argument. Let's go on. This is just silly. Well, that's actually not what the Bible says. The Bible says that God is unchanging, and and you can see this in verses such as Numbers 20-19. I'm going to read a verse that I think better communicates this, which is Malachi chapter 3, verse 6, which says, because I, Yahweh, have not changed, you descendants of Jacob have not been destroyed. He says, God can be unchanging, and it still be possible that God can make lying not immoral or even moral. Yeah, let me read that again. I want to make sure that I only watched the first few minutes of the video before I started responding to this. It just looked like something I could easily ad-lib without having to do any extra reading. And apparently I was right so far. Let's read this again. God can be unchanging, and it still be possible that God can make lying not immoral or even moral. Well, no. If God cannot change, then he cannot do anything any other way, so that would make it logically impossible for him to make a different set of laws other than what he has already made. So he is completely wrong. He does not understand what I just said. And that's something maybe he'll do some more reading and figure it out. Who knows? I'm not holding my breath, though. Let's go on to the next portion. You see, God doesn't change. And if God doesn't change, then there's no possible world where God could create a world where murder is actually permissible. This is non sequitur. It actually does follow. If God cannot change, then he'll never institute another set of moral laws that contradicts the one that he had already set forth. So no, it's not a non sequitur. If you're going to try and give a fallacy, at least try and explain why you think it's a fallacy. Otherwise, you're just making an assertion anyway. Let's go on to the next objection. It's not possible that God would make a world that has a different set of 10 commandments, for instance. So why is it not possible? Well, in the Christian epistemology, we go by the Scriptures, and the Scripture says that God doesn't change. So if God doesn't change, he's not going to institute another set of moral values. So that's... Sorry, I accidentally clicked the beginning of the video. I got to find it again. Let's see here. And we're going to get, I accidentally saw ahead of some of the other slides. We're going to get into some pretty comical stuff in a second. So let's go ahead and go on. Oh, and by the way, I just want to remind Sextus Empiricus that I'm speaking from the Christian epistemology. He has to get inside my epistemology and show how it's not possible, given the truth of my axiom, that God does not change. But instead, he's just reading his own worldview into mine, which is a no-no and results in straw men and other fallacies. And it's not because God doesn't have the power to do so. It's because God has a particular nature, and he's going to exercise his power according to that nature. He says, so God is limited by God's nature. Does he not have the power to defy God's nature? Well, yes, he has the power to do so, but it doesn't mean he will. His nature is about what the nature of God is about. Different attributes of God concerning God's law, God's power, God's knowledge, and a bunch of other things about God. But just because God has the power to defy his own nature, like for instance, God could lie. He has the power to speak and lie, but he won't do it because God's not going to do something, for instance, that he does. Like let's say, for instance, for example, to illustrate my point, Psalms 115:3, where it says and actually I'll just get my Bible and read it. But it says that basically God can do what he wishes. Let's just go ahead and go to the actual Psalm. Psalms 115:3. It says, our God is in the heavens. He does all that he pleases. Why would God do something that he doesn't want to do? That's going to be part of his nature. God doesn't want to lie. And that's why he doesn't lie, because he doesn't want to be a liar. It's very simple. So God's nature doesn't necessarily limit his power. It just helps determine how God's going to use his power. That's all I'm saying. And he says, why does God have a particular nature and not another one? Well, because of what I just said in the video. Malachi 3:6, God doesn't change. That's why. Let's go on to the next one. Oh, before we go on to the next one, I also wrote an article on the omnipotence paradox, which would also address an objection of this nature. It's on the website. Just Google "Answer for Hope Omnipotence Paradox Solved," and you'll see what my position is on that issue in more detail. So, because it's not possible for God to change, it's not possible for God to make a world where there's a different set of state of affairs concerning moral values than what we already have in the actual world. He said, if it's not gospel for God to change God's nature, how is God omnipotent? Well, it's not possible for lack of power, which, omnipotence means infinite in power. God's not being able to change his nature is not because he doesn't have the power to do so. It's because God's nature is unchanging. So, again, he's conflating the power of God with God's nature, which is two completely different things. But by now I would expect him to make such blatant conflations. So this is of no surprise to me. Let's go on to the next one. And again, if God is not sufficient to ground moral values in, then I have to recur to my question: what is? Because if God's not sufficient, then why would any government entity be sufficient to define what's objectively good and what's objectively evil? Bait and switch. Yeah, he needs to explain. Let's go ahead and go back and see if I can hear. I'm going to still double check and give him the benefit of the doubt and see if I said anything that was a bait and switch. And again, if God is not sufficient to ground moral values in, then I have to recur to my question: what is? Because if God's not sufficient, then why would any government entity be sufficient to define what's objectively good and what's objectively evil? No, it's not really a bait and switch. It's a logical implication. If God does not have the authority, the creator of the universe does not have the authority to impose moral laws on his subjects, then the government that founded a country certainly wouldn't have the right. I mean, it's just by logical implication. It follows the objection to the government would follow the same flow of logic as the objection that the atheist would be bringing up to God. So if an atheist says that God doesn't have the authority to impose moral laws on his subjects, then the atheist would also have to conclude that the government doesn't have any right to impose any sort of law or moral authority on its subjects either. So no, it's not a bait and switch, and the fact that he calls it this kind of shows that he doesn't know what a bait and switch is. Let's go on to the next portion. Okay, it says moral values and moral facts are two different things. I guess it depends on how you define moral values and moral facts, but he hasn't defined either one, so I'll just stay silent on this particular one. So these are the points that I wanted to make briefly. I'm probably going to write an article on this too. So you guys just feel free to stay tuned, and I thank you for watching. Because I'm going to have to tear the article to pieces as well. Will there be any actual content? Well, actually, no, because I haven't written the article yet. So no, there's no actual content to the article. I apologize. I haven't gotten around to it. I think that's all of it. But yes, he is so snarky and egotistical. But as you can see from, he's careless. He's ignorant on certain philosophical matters. I'm sorry, but if you cannot properly represent someone's position, then you're not in any position to say that you're any good at doing philosophy. Reading philosophy and reading things about, and reading articles about different philosophers and actually doing philosophy are two different things. If you're doing philosophy, then you're arguing for a position or arguing against something. Apparently, this particular atheist cannot do philosophy. He's shown a complete inability to do it. He needs to be more careful. He really, in my summation, made himself look like a fool by being so careless and then trying to spin this off as if he's somehow taking me to task. I would like to invite him, if he really thinks he can stand up to my criticisms and actually debate me, I would be more than happy to have him on my channel and talk about it. I've had atheists on my channel before, and I was polite to them and I let them speak. I would be happy to let him speak and defend his position further. If he wants to try and read his own semantics of the mind, that's fine. And to my, his own definitions into my position, that's fine. I'm just going to call him on it every time he does it. So, Sextus Empiricus, I invite you to have this discussion with me. If you don't want to do it, that's fine. It may make it look like to some that you would be afraid to debate me. But if you don't want to do it, then I'm not going to call you a coward or anything. It's your choice as to whether you want to talk to me about this or not. Or if you want to make another video, you can. I may or may not respond to it. Especially if it's a lot of the same things that you had said before. So, but he didn't notify. But I just want to make this clear. He did not notify me that he responded to me, but and I think I sort of insinuated that when I first started this video, but he's not really. I mean, I don't hold people to tell me every time they respond to me. I'm sure there's a bunch of different responses to things I've said or written that I don't even know about. I don't, if anyone wants to respond to any of my videos, I'm not going to get upset if they don't notify me. So that's really about it. Everyone who stuck with me this far, I appreciate you watching, and I hope that whether you're an atheist or a Christian or something else, that you can take something valuable away from this video.